Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer. And this video is one in our series regarding forms revisions that took effect July 11, 2023. The form we're talking about today is Form 35, the inspection contingency, and there is a teeny tiny change with huge consequences if you're not paying attention. I guarantee there will be buyer brokers who inadvertently waive their buyer's inspection contingency because they weren't paying attention to the form's revisions. So I'm glad you're tuned in. It won't be you. Here's the change. If you look at the face of Form 35, under paragraph 4, you'll notice that there are now 3 checkbox provisions. These are checkboxes that seller would typically deal with when seller is accepting or countering buyer's offer. The boilerplate language of Form 35 leading up to these 3 checkboxes says the following. Buyer is prohibited in all circumstances from delivering any portion of buyer's inspection report without seller's consent. Now, prior to this form's revision, there was an exception which said, except when buyer is triggering the additional inspection time, and then buyer must attach a copy of the inspector's recommendations. That's gone. That exception language is gone. And so now the prohibition stands alone to say buyer is prohibited from delivering any portion of buyer's inspection report without seller's consent. And then the 3 check mark boxes under paragraph 4 provide the opportunity for seller to consent to receive some or all of buyer's inspection report. And as an aside, the 3 checkbox provisions under paragraph 4 in Form 35 are mirrored on Form 35C. So the exact, or I should say replicated, that's probably a better word. The exact same checkbox provisions that you see under paragraph 4 of Form 35 are also located on Form 35C, as in consent, a standalone form. Seller can consent to receive some or all of buyer's inspection report at the time of mutual acceptance by marking one of the boxes on the face of Form 35, or if seller wants to consent later in the transaction to receive some or all of buyer's inspection report, they could deliver a Form 35C later in the transaction. Here's what those 3 checkbox provisions say. The first says that buyer will deliver all of buyer's inspection report. The second checkbox provision says that buyer will deliver only the portions of buyer's inspection report associated with buyer's request for concessions. And then the third checkbox provision says that buyer will deliver only inspector's recommendation for additional inspections. So putting all of that background information together, what does this mean to the transaction? It means that if none of those boxes are marked at the time of mutual acceptance, and buyer has done their inspection, and buyer is now ready to trigger the additional inspection time, all that buyer will deliver to seller in order to trigger the additional inspection time is the Form 35R with the appropriate box marked for buyer to take the additional inspection time. Buyer broker, do not deliver any portion of buyer's inspection report unless seller has asked for it, including inspector's recommendation for additional inspections. If seller does ask for inspector's recommendation for additional inspections, then buyer broker, the only thing you're delivering in response is the few words, the 5 or 6 words that it takes for the inspector to recommend additional inspections. If those few words are housed on a page of the inspection report that also includes pictures or analysis or conclusions, none of that can be provided if all that seller has asked for is inspector's recommendation for additional inspections. All of that other extraneous information must be redacted from the page before it's provided to seller in response to that third checkbox. The other significant change to Form 35, housed in this same section of the report, changes the significance of seller's consent to receive some or all of buyer's inspection report to effectively a demand. Where seller used to simply consent or ask, if you will, for a copy of buyer's inspection report or some portion of it, with the revised form, if seller marks one of those boxes, that's a demand for buyer to provide that portion of the inspection report, and buyer is compelled to do so. When buyer and seller enter the Form 35 as part of the purchase and sale agreement, buyer agrees to deliver whatever portion of buyer's inspection report that seller consents to receive. So the big changes: buyers don't send any portion of the inspection report unless seller consents, including inspector's recommendations for additional inspections. And then whatever seller does consent to receive, buyer is obligated to deliver. Here's the risk, buyer brokers. In addition to sending some portion of the report that you're not supposed to do, that's the obvious risk. Here's the less obvious risk. Your buyer is not allowed to take additional inspections, the time for additional inspections, unless buyer's inspector has actually recommended those. So if you, buyer broker, deliver the notice of additional inspections, Form 35R, you don't include the additional inspections recommendation from the inspector because you're not allowed to, and then subsequent to buyer's delivery of the notice triggering the additional inspections, if then seller says, show me the inspector's recommendation, seller might deliver the Form 35C with that third box marked, even after buyer has delivered the notice of additional inspections. If that happens and seller says, I demand, essentially, that you provide me a copy of the inspector's recommendations, then buyer broker, your buyer has to deliver that recommendation from buyer's inspector. And if buyer fails to do so, then buyer fails to trigger the additional inspection time, meaning that buyer's inspection contingency would have expired when the initial inspection period ended. If you have questions on Form 35 and its revisions or any other topic, please visit warealtor.org following the links to the legal hotline and ask me a question. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.